Elena stood frozen before the wreckage of her small seaside restaurant, the place where she had poured her heart and soul. Shattered glass glinted under the morning sun, while the collapsed awning covered overturned tables and chairs. The storm from the night before had taken everything, not just her property, but the hopes and future she had worked so hard to build. She clenched her fists, fighting back the tears. This restaurant wasn't just a business, it was her mother's legacy, the place where she had learned to cook from family recipes passed down for generations. Here, she had turned her passion into reality. But now, all that remained was ruin. Her phone buzzed, a call from the bank. She knew they wouldn't wait any longer. The loan she had taken to expand the restaurant had now become an unbearable burden. There was no money left for repairs, no way to keep the business running. Days passed in a blur of despair and uncertainty. She met with creditors, hoping to negotiate for more time, but the answer was always the same: no payment, no restaurant. Then, out of nowhere, Adrian, a wealthy real estate mogul, made her an unexpected offer. He wasn't interested in buying her restaurant. Instead, he proposed something else entirely. "I need someone to carry my child. In exchange, I'll pay off your debts and provide the financial support to rebuild your restaurant." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Such a proposition, it was absurd, almost cold-hearted. Yet, standing at the edge of financial ruin, did she really have another choice? Elena sat in a small cafe in the heart of the city, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Across from her, Adrian sat with an air of confidence, his gaze cold yet unwavering. His proposal still echoed in her mind. "Are you really serious about this?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief and hesitation. Adrian nodded without hesitation. "I don't believe in love or marriage, but I need an heir, and I want to handle this in the most efficient way possible." His words made Elena feel like she was discussing a business contract rather than making a life-altering decision. Carrying a child wasn't just a transaction, but in her current situation, did she really have the luxury of refusing? Adrian slid a folder across the table toward her. "This is the contract. You'll receive enough money to clear your debts and rebuild your restaurant. During the pregnancy, I'll ensure you have everything you need." Elena stared at the papers in front of her. A single decision that could change her life forever. If she accepted, she would be free from financial ruin. But at what cost? She closed her eyes, searching for an answer deep within herself. Her life had always been filled with difficult choices. When her mother passed away, she had given up her education to take over the restaurant. She had always been the one to sacrifice for the things that mattered. Finally, she took a deep breath and picked up the pen. "All right, I agree," Adrian nodded, showing no surprise. It was as if he had anticipated her answer. He retrieved the contract, his piercing gaze flickering with something unreadable. "Elena, from now on, you'll be living in my estate. I want to ensure the child receives the best care possible." Elena stiffened. She had known this arrangement would change her life, but she hadn't expected to be pulled into Adrian's world, a world so distant and cold. But there was no turning back now. She had just signed a contract that could define the rest of her life. The first few days at Adrian's estate were overwhelming for Elena. Everything felt too unfamiliar, too grand, yet too cold. The massive house was adorned with elegant furniture, and the staff catered to her every need. But no one truly spoke to her beyond polite greetings. Adrian was no exception. He worked long hours and was rarely home. When they did see each other at dinner, their conversations were brief and formal. He was attentive but distant. Elena began to feel like a stranger in her own life. One morning, she woke up feeling nauseous. She rushed to the bathroom, gripping the sink as she tried to steady herself. Pregnancy? It felt strange and terrifying. When she finally stepped out, she was startled to find Adrian standing there, watching her closely. "Are you all right?" His voice was low, steady. Elena instinctively nodded, but she noticed something in his gaze: concern. It surprised her. "I'll call the doctor," Adrian stated, leaving no room for argument. From that day on, Adrian's behavior began to shift. He was no longer just the man behind the contract. Each morning, he asked how she was feeling. If she craved something, he made sure the chef prepared it immediately. Once, as she was descending the staircase, she lost her balance for a second. Before she could fall, Adrian caught her, his hands gripping her tightly, instinctively. In that fleeting moment, Elena felt a warmth, a sincerity he was trying to hide. And that scared her. She didn't want to hope. This was just an arrangement, not a love story. Adrian felt it too. He was giving Elena more attention than he had ever intended. He reminded himself that this was just a transaction, yet every time he saw her, feelings he never expected started to emerge. One evening, as Elena sat in the garden staring at the stars, Adrian appeared beside her. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Elena was silent for a long moment before she finally whispered, "I don't know. I'm afraid I'm starting to feel things I shouldn't." Adrian didn't respond right away. He watched her intently as if struggling with his own thoughts. They both knew things were changing, but were they ready to admit it? Time passed and Elena's belly grew with each passing day. She could no longer deny that the baby inside her wasn't just part of a contract. It was part of her. She felt every tiny kick, every small movement, a constant reminder that this was real. One late afternoon, as Elena sat in Adrian's office, flipping through a book on newborn care, Adrian walked in. "What are you reading?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. She hesitated before looking up at him. Slowly, she placed a gentle hand on her belly, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I was thinking about a name for the baby." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "What name do you have in mind?" She paused, then murmured, "I want something that means hope." Adrian fell silent for a moment. Then, in a voice unusually warm, he said, "Luca, it means light." "What do you think?" Elena blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to care about something like this. Her fingers traced gentle circles over her belly, feeling a small kick in response. "Luca," she whispered, "I like it." For the first time, this moment had nothing to do with a contract or an agreement. It was just two people waiting for the arrival of their child. But then, that happiness was shattered by a painful truth. That evening, Elena overheard a conversation between Adrian and his lawyer. "Once the baby is born, all arrangements will be finalized. She'll receive the rest of the money and leave," Adrian said, his tone firm and calculated. Elena's heart clenched. So no matter what moments they had shared, no matter the warmth she had started to feel, to him, this was still just a deal. Her hands curled into fists as she fought back tears. But when Adrian turned and saw her, the pain in her eyes was impossible to hide. "Elena," he said her name softly, realizing something was wrong. She stood up, her voice shaking but resolute. "So, that's it. You never even considered keeping me here. From the start, I was just another part of your plan, wasn't I?" Adrian didn't answer. For the first time, he was at a loss for words. Elena let out a bitter laugh, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was a fool to think that we had something beyond a contract." She turned and walked away, leaving Adrian standing there, conflicted and suddenly aware of something he had never expected: the fear of losing her. That night, Elena packed her bags. She knew that if she stayed, her heart would shatter even more. But just as she stepped out the door, a firm hand grasped her wrist. "Elena, don't go!" Adrian's voice broke, raw with desperation. He stepped closer, his grip tightening, as if letting her go would shatter him completely. "I can't lose you." "I won't." His breathing was unsteady, his usual composed demeanor crumbling. "If you walk away now, I don't know how to fix this, but I swear to you, I will spend every day trying if you just give me the chance." Elena stood frozen in the grand hallway, her hands clenched so tightly that they trembled. Adrian was holding on to her, as if letting go meant losing her forever. She could feel the urgency in his grip, the warmth of his fingers wrapped around her wrist. Silent, desperate. "Don't go," he said, his voice hoarse. Elena bit her lip, her heart aching. "Why, Adrian? Isn't this what you wanted? Wasn't I just part of the deal? A contract, a woman carrying your child, only to leave when it's done?" Adrian shook his head, his grip tightening. "No, I was wrong, Elena." She let out a bitter laugh, but it caught in her throat, mixed with tears and heartbreak. "Wrong? When did you realize that? When I started hoping. When I started believing that maybe, just maybe, this was more than just a contract." Adrian looked at her, his eyes raw with emotions he had never let himself show before. For the first time, the cold and distant man looked afraid of losing her. "The first time I saw you place your hand on your belly and smile when you felt the baby kick," he whispered, his voice shaking slightly, "the moment you talked about naming him, something inside me changed. I told myself it was just responsibility, just part of the deal. But every time I saw you laugh, every time I heard you talk to our son, I felt something I didn't understand. And it terrified me. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't in control. I wasn't just protecting an heir. I was protecting the only family I have ever truly wanted." Elena froze. She thought back to all the moments, the way Adrian had watched her silently, the small yet thoughtful gestures, the way he worried when she was unwell, the late-night meals he personally prepared whenever she craved something. She had convinced herself that it was just responsibility, but now, looking into his eyes, she realized it wasn't obligation, it was love. A love he hadn't even realized himself. "What do you want from me, Adrian?" Her voice broke. He released her wrist, but his gaze never wavered. "I want a family, not just with Luca, but with you." Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks, but this time they weren't out of pain, but because she knew he meant every word. 3 months later, the warm scent of freshly baked bread filled the cozy little restaurant, sunlight spilling through the large windows, casting a golden glow over Elena's serene smile. She never thought she'd be back here, but Adrian had kept his promise. He hadn't just helped her rebuild the restaurant, he had stayed, day after day, proving that his love wasn't just words. And when their son was born, Adrian had held him close, his voice unsteady as he whispered, "Welcome to the world, Luca. I promise I'll always be here." Elena looked at him, her heart finally at peace after all the storms they had weathered. She reached for his hand, placing it over their son's tiny fingers. For the first time, they weren't two strangers bound by a contract. They were a family. 3 months later, Elena's life had completely changed. She didn't just have a new restaurant, she had a man who would do anything for her and their son. Adrian was no longer the cold man he once was. He cared for Luca, stayed by her side every day, proving his love not just through words, but through actions. But despite everything, Elena still hesitated, afraid that one day all of this might disappear. But Adrian never gave up. One evening, he took her to the beach, where the moonlight shimmered over the waves. They walked together in silence, enjoying the peaceful night, until Adrian suddenly stopped and turned to her. "Elena," he said softly. She looked up at him, her heart pounding when she saw him kneel down on one knee, holding a sparkling ring. "You changed me, Elena," Adrian said, his voice deep with emotion. "I used to think I didn't need anyone, that love was a weakness, but then you came into my life, and you made me see that love isn't weakness. It's what makes life worth living. I don't just want a child. I don't just want a deal. I want you, every part of you, forever." Elena's breath hitched. The man who once saw her as nothing more than an agreement was now bearing his soul to her. Her heart swelled with emotions too strong to contain. This wasn't a contract. This wasn't a deal. This was love. Elena held her breath, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Marry me, Elena, not because of a contract, but because I love you. More than anything." A choked laugh escaped her lips as tears finally fell. She had once thought she could never believe in love again, but looking into Adrian's eyes now, she knew. This wasn't a transaction. This was a promise. With a trembling smile, she whispered, "Yes." Adrian stood, pulling her into his arms, holding her as if she was the most precious thing in the world. 3 months later, their wedding day. The beach glowed under the golden sunlight, white silk ribbons dancing in the wind. Elena walked down an aisle covered in delicate rose petals, her wedding dress flowing gracefully around her. At the end of the path, Adrian stood waiting, his eyes locked on her. And when she reached him, placing her hand in his, he held on tight, silently vowing to never let her go. Vows were exchanged, love filling every word. As Adrian leaned down to press the first kiss upon his wife's lips, applause and cheers rang out. From a distance, little Luca, cradled in the arms of his babysitter, giggled happily as if he too understood the joy of the moment. They were no longer just a couple. They were a family. 1 year later, the sun bathed their small garden in golden light as Elena played with Luca, the little boy now running with wobbly steps, his laughter ringing through the air. Her restaurant flourished, their home was filled with love, and happiness surrounded them. Adrian walked up, wrapping an arm around her waist and pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "I love you." Elena smiled, leaning into him. "I love you too." As they watched Luca run toward them, his tiny arms outstretched, Adrian bent down and scooped him up into his arms, spinning him around as the boy's laughter echoed through the garden. Elena laughed, watching them, her heart swelling with warmth. Adrian turned to her, holding their son close. "You know," he said, smiling, "I used to think happiness was something people only dreamed about. But now, I wake up every morning, and it's right here, in front of me." Elena reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Because we built it together."